All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us here today, talking about a set of very important issues, financial weaponization, debanking, and ESG policy, what I call politicized investing, and government regulation. So with me today is my distinct pleasure to be here with SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce, and a special honor for me because this is the second time that Commissioner Peirce and I have managed to have a public conversation. She was able to join us a couple years ago at the CEI Summit in Lake Tahoe, Nevada. So if you are looking for exciting policy experiences, consider signing up for the next CEI Summit to be in Bar Harbor, Maine, also with more distinguished guests. So, Commissioner, thank you for being here. And I want to give you a chance, if you want, just to give sort of very brief opening remarks before we get to questions about tenure at the Commission, your approach these issues, or what you see going forward, however you want to frame it.
Sure. Well, thank you, Richard, and thanks to everyone. It's great to be with you all today. Thank you to CEI for hosting this event. I do have to give you my disclaimer, which is my views are my own views as a commissioner, not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners. I've been at the SEC since January 2018. The time has flown by, but there have been many interesting debates during that time. I wanted to go to the SEC as a commissioner. I had been there before as a staffer because I believe so strongly in the power of capital markets to transform people's lives. The idea that anyone can come to the markets as an investor and enjoy sharing in the growth of companies, and that anyone can come as a capital taker, and someone who has a good idea doesn't need to have rich friends, doesn't need to be chummy with the person at the bank. You can go to the capital markets, and the system's not perfect, but you can get your good ideas funded. And so I think that the United States should treat our capital markets as a treasure, and we should be very careful not to transform them into something other than they were intended to be, which is really to enable capital to flow to its highest and best use. And so what I've seen at my time at the SEC is that there's a lot of pressure to turn the capital markets into something else. Instead of shifting money to its highest and best use as determined by the grassroots, by lots and lots of different minds all over the country, making choices whether to buy or sell something, whether to invest or not to invest. The transformation has really been to try to channel that money in ways that please a small group of very influential, we call them stakeholders. And those people are not investors, and they're not the people who are running the companies, but they're people who have special interests. And if we allow that to happen, it will radically diminish the effectiveness of the capital markets. And interestingly, it will also radically impair the ability of the capital markets to serve many of the goals that those people who are stakeholders are trying to achieve. The most efficient way to bring prosperity to society is to have money flow to its highest and best use, to have funds flow freely, not as determined by political demands, but as determined by what people actually need and what people want to buy. And so I think this is a really important moment for us to defend the capital markets and to defend their ability to really improve people's lives, and not to politicize them either from the right or from the left. So with that, why don't we get into questions?
Excellent. That's a great summary. So just, again, one more sort of framing moment. We're sort of talking about two different but closely related phenomena when we talk about ESG, environmental, social, and governance, as a sort of a lens or approach to investing. If individual investors or particular institutional investors want to pursue what we would call an ESG approach, I certainly believe they should be able to. The sort of backlash to woke investing, if you will, is not to have an inverse of that and require everyone to invest in oil and gas or firearms or anything like that. It's to allow the greatest amount of market freedom for all participants. But when we talk about ESG financial regulation or ESG policy, that's very different, because that government regulation comes in and does have the effect of pushing people, nudging people in a particular direction, which is, I think, the much more controversial premise. So feel free to divest from whichever stocks you think are sinful, but hopefully not require every other citizen in the United States to do the same. So question the first. So based on our experience so far and your own previous remarks, it seems like ESG proponents, especially proponents of ESG policy, kind of want to have it both ways. So they want to pretend that their policies are sort of advisory and hortatory, and they're suggestions, and they're reminding you to keep in mind certain investment risks, and they're not trying to commandeer your investment decisions, tell you where to invest. But they also seem to have very little patience when their suggestions are not taken to heart, and plenty of I wrote about this a few years ago. Plenty of ESG proponents said a few years ago, well, yes, it was important that we have this voluntary phase of an ESG investing movement, but the time for voluntary is gone. Now we need binding regulations to push people in the right direction. Do you think ESG policy can be just advisory and hortatory and in a free market, or were the people who are the biggest ESG proponents, was it always going to end up with mandatory regulation they wanted?
Yeah, and Richard, I'm glad you pointed out that people should be free to make their own decisions. I mean, I think that's why the system works, because you've got lots and lots of different people. Everyone has different experiences and backgrounds and preferences, and everyone's making different decisions about how to invest. People have different expectations about what's going to make a company profitable and what's not going to make a company profitable. And, go to town, you can invest however you want. Just as Richard said, don't try to tell everyone else through regulation how to invest. You're welcome to get out there on whatever social media platform you want and propound your view of investing. That's fine too. We should encourage that kind of dialogue. But I think what people talk about when they talk about just this voluntary, we're only sort of encouraging this kind of investment. It actually uses mechanisms that end up being pretty mandatory. And so you have people using, for example, proxy advisor firms, which have a lot of reach because a lot of asset managers, for example, will vote the way a proxy advisor recommends that they vote, because there's so many voting decisions these asset managers have to make that it's often just easiest to follow the course that the proxy advisor sets. So if you can get your proxy advisor to recommend voting for something, you actually can end up in the something that you're voting for might just be a precatory proposal, they call it, something that says, hey, we think the company should do a carbon emissions audit. And then so that passes, the company doesn't have to do it, but you're putting the company on the spot essentially to do something like that. And so it effectively leads to giving leverage to people who are trying to push for certain things. And that leverage can be exercised in a back room where no one sees what they're doing to, it's a deal. Please take the shareholder proposal off and we will do XYZ to make you happy. And so you end up with a lot of pressure campaigns. Another way it can work is asset managers might sign on to net zero commitment. And that means that they're committing the funds that they're managing, which are not their funds, it's their investors' funds. They're committing them to go in a certain direction. And again, it looks all nice. It's just a voluntary compact that they're signing on to, but it ends up having the effect of taking large passive mutual funds and investing them in a way that is consistent with that net zero pledge, even though those passive mutual fund shareholders, when they were buying that mutual fund, thought that they were buying a passive fund that wouldn't invest actively or take active voting and engagement decisions. So I think there are ways in which the system as it works now ends up turning that voluntary into mandatory. Again, I don't think either of us would disagree that it's perfectly fine for people to take their money and do whatever they want with it. But if we see what has happened, it tends to be that things sort of slide into the mandatory.
Right. Now, the acronym ESG and those three words, environmental, social, and governance, cover a giant range of policy topics. Almost social alone covers almost everything theoretically. But I think the highest profile policies that we've seen in the past several years have been divided into kind of two major categories. You've got the environmental goals, which is mostly climate change and decarbonization. And then the biggest social policy goal has really been the diversity, equity, inclusion, sort of DEI goals, which includes, workforce policies on hiring for, racial, ethnic, sexual identity. So, a lot of polling has shown that, U.S. voters look at those two categories very differently, and the former actually are slightly more popular, but as conservatives especially tend to see the latter, the sort of racial classifications, as more sort of wrong-headed and problematic. So I guess what does it say about ESG as a sort of, supposedly it's a cohesive framework, like it's a thing that all fits together, we're told, that modern business should embrace. But given that some are more problematic than others, does it make sense even for ESG proponents themselves to sort of unbundle these things and stop trying to make it an all or nothing deal?
I think it really does. I mean, there's a reason why ESG proponents often want to stick everything together, and frankly, why ESG opponents also want to stick everything together, because it makes it easier to do a study, right? You can do a study and you can say, ESG funds do worse or ESG funds do better. But what is an ESG fund? Well, it changes over time. It changes from one advisor to the next. And the category of things that's being dumped into ESG keeps growing because we all can think of new issues that we think are important, and sometimes it changes. You have a war with Ukraine and all of a sudden weapons become something that shifts into the S positive category, whereas before it was S negative. People fight over which energy sources go in the environmental positive category and which in the negative, and that might change over time too. And so really we're putting together this muddle, and we're trying to have this intellectual debate over a muddle, when in reality you do have to pull those things apart. And that's why I say, as a securities regulator, I don't think I need to do anything different for ESG. If an issue is material to the long-term value of a company, material risk, for example, the company already has to disclose it. And our disclosure framework is set up to work for lots of different companies doing lots of different things with lots of different risks. And it's designed to say to people, tell us what your risks are. And so we can use that framework, and we don't need to know what's in this ESG bucket. But I think people are using the put everything in one bucket approach to say, well, anything that I label as ESG has got to be good for a company. And that's not very productive. And I also think it's kind of funny because it leads to very weird results, right? You have sustainable bonds, which they started out with really a focus on the E, but then people said, well, wait a minute. You can't just have people thinking about climate. You also need to have people thinking about women on boards. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to have a sustainable bond that's going to have different key performance indicators. And some of them are going to be related to your carbon emissions, and some of them are going to be related to how many women you stick on your board. And you're going to get different interest rates depending on which combination of those two things you achieve. And I just think it's funny in a way. I mean, it's sad to me, but it's also funny because, and a little offensive, because on the one hand, I always find women targets for boards interesting, because I'm on a board with another woman who's, a colleague I've really enjoyed working with. But we have very different views on things. So if you took her and put her on a board and took me and put me on a board, you're going to get two very different outcomes. The fact that we're both women is really not even very relevant. But then what I think is even more interesting is that now you're saying, well, you can either put Hester on a board or you can reduce your scope 3 emissions by X amount. Take your pick. And so all of a sudden I've become an alternative for lowering your greenhouse gas emissions. So.
We won't require you to disclose your carbon footprint. Although I do want to that remind me of an interesting research finding. I want to mention that my good friend, Professor Siri Turgison of Florida Atlantic University, studied this about European requirements for female representation on boards, and she found that after those requirements were phased in, the percentage of board members who were either the niece or the granddaughter of CEOs and chairmen went up dramatically. So more representation.
And I mean, I think all of us can agree that companies need to be as creative as possible in expanding the network to try to find qualified board members. And I think there are some really interesting ways to do that. And the obvious result of that is going to be that you're going to get all kinds of people because you're going to be searching beyond your golf club. And that's great, right? You don't want to have everyone coming from the country club. You want to have some people who have really interesting expertise. But it's just such a ham-handed way to get there for the reasons that you're saying, because then you end up with even more, a closed loop of people because you're picking people that you know.
So speaking of some international comparisons, we have a situation now where it comes to corporate governance and finance regulation where I think we may be sort of diverging internationally. We hear a lot about, convergence of regulatory standards and harmonization, but the EU seems to be moving in a direction more what in the U.S. we would consider a sort of progressive left policy direction with greater mandates and government control. And they also have a new climate disclosure regime for companies that's coming in. While in this country we have a new Trump administration, we have Republican control of Congress, which would suggest perhaps our policy moving in an opposite direction. What do you think that's going to mean for multinational firms? So big internationals who are doing business both in the U.S., in the EU, and differing requirements.
I mean, I think this is really going to be a massive issue for the United States because one thing that Europe has realized, I think, is that the requirements that they're putting on companies are so intense that they are going to have a material effect on those companies' competitive abilities. And it's requirements just in terms of collecting the data that you need to collect in order to comply with their directives around sustainability, because there's more and more and more data points that they're requiring you to collect. And then, of course, there's also an effort to direct money to particular industries or particular activities that regulators have determined are green. And so that means that you're having central determinations made by government regulators about what products and services companies should be making, and that's not going to be good for economic growth. So Europe is in a position where they've put a huge weight on their economy. And so when they look at the world and they look at the competing companies around the world, they say we've got to figure out a way to put that same weight on all of our competitors. And they're doing that through extraterritorial application of their regulations, quite aggressive extraterritorial application. And that is, they can do that and say, well, we're just trying to achieve harmonization. But I think we have to push back against that. Now, unfortunately, sometimes the U.S. has been a bit extraterritorial, speaking from an agency that sometimes reaches across borders to try to regulate activity that is not in our purview either. I understand some of the frustration that Europeans have, but I think that this is an area where we really have to push back. Europe, I think, is realizing the cost of what they're doing. So there is some movement to pare back, but I think it's going to be, paring back from a pretty extreme position is still going to be an extreme position. And so we're going to have these conversations about what to do about that. Can you have some sort of mutual recognition? We at the SEC adopted a climate rule, but it's been challenged, and so I don't know what will happen with that. So we'll see, but someone could say, well, the SEC has a climate rule, so shouldn't that be enough? But I think we really have to have this conversation a lot more focused on Europe. Do you really think that you're doing the right thing? Because you're going to hurt your growth. You're not going to be able to have an economy that's flexible enough and responsive enough to develop the technologies that we need to solve all these really great problems that we have. The developing nations really need to be able to use energy because they need to be able to raise the standard of living so that all of those children who are there can grow up and can become the engineers that are going to solve the problems of the futures. We've got so much human talent there. And you have to have a prosperous economy so that those kids can go to school, get educated, get the nutrition they need, and then develop the solutions that we need as a planet. And so I think we need to have just a broader conversation about whether the European approach is really the right way and see if we can make some headway there.
Nice. Well, on that topic, I would also like to give a shout out to my distinguished colleague Stone Washington, who just had we just published a paper of his comparing the potentially cumulative burdens of climate disclosure rules in the state of California, climate disclosure rules at the SEC, and climate disclosure rules at the EU, with some large companies potentially being subject to all of them.
Yeah. I think that's the California piece of it is also an important piece to mention.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of big picture policymaking, really not just about ESG. So there's something that you wrote that I think is especially relevant here, and people in the audience may have heard it already because it was much quoted. So when the commission was voting to publish the draft climate disclosure rule, you wrote, current SEC disclosure mandates are intended to provide investors with an accurate picture of the company's present and prospective performance through managers' own eyes. But the climate disclosure proposal, by contrast, tells corporate managers how regulators, doing the bidding of an array of non-investor stakeholders, expect them to run their companies. So that seems like a pretty major change in the orientation of regulatory agencies and how they work. And again, it goes beyond ESG goals and policy, and ends up being what some of our friends in the conservative legal movement would call a matter of constitutional hygiene, about whether we're following constitutional norms or not. What do you think would be required to reverse this way of thinking? Is this something that changes with new leadership of the agency? Is this an intervention from Congress? Are federal courts going to step in and say, no, this is the wrong orientation?
Well, I think it is partly just the SEC taking a look at itself. We just turned 90, right? And so it's a good time for us to be a little bit introspective and say, what is it we're here for? And we're here as a disclosure regulator. We're not here as a merit regulator. We're not supposed to be running companies. We're just supposed to be helping investors understand what those companies are doing. And so I think that's really what we need to do, is just take a look at that. The courts may have something to say about this as well, but I think we can really do this. And you mentioned that it's not just climate. We're doing this with cyber as well. We look at these companies and we adopted a rule around cyber event disclosure and cyber policy disclosure. And really, in some way, the way that we adopted that rule and the way that we're implementing our cyber disclosure requirements looks to me like we're trying to tell companies how to manage their cyber, which we're not qualified to do. It's not what we were asked by Congress to do. And I think it could have the very harmful effect of having everyone trying to build their cyber policies so that they make us happy instead of build them so that they prevent hackers from stealing customer and company information. So yeah, I mean, I think it really does require us and people on the outside to hold us to account for really sticking to our mission.
So write those regulatory comments, people. That is our session with Commissioner Peirce. Thank you very
Thank
much
you
for
so
being
much.
with us.
Thank you.